السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد. So welcome back for those who have been in the first session, and welcome to our new brothers who are joining new in this new session. Jazakumullahu khairan. So this topic was on the inimitability of the Qur'an. How the Qur'an is inimitable or not able to match anything like it. So as you can see in the slide, in the screen, this calligraphy says, لا يأتون بمثله. They would not bring anything like it, referring to the Qur'an itself or its surahs, nothing like it, or even the ayah, they won't bring anything like it. So I'm just going to, for the first few minutes, recap what I have mentioned before, so at least it has a, continuous understanding of where we are at the present moment in this session, very quickly, so bear with me. So just go back quickly, so in a few minutes, so you know that the subject matter is quite broad. Okay, so we talked about the objectives of this session were to understand the purpose of the challenge of the Qur'an, because the Qur'an challenges. And who does the Qur'an challenge? We talked about what was the nature of the challenge and how the challenge was linked to a miracle or a mu'jiza. And then, let me get my slides back. And we said there are lots of things that we can actually learn in going through understanding the challenge of the Qur'an. What are the different types of challenges that were involved the Qur'an makes, and what does it actually mean, bring something like it, and why was the challenge issued in the first place? Who was the challenge directed to? Was the challenge for only a specific time then, or is the challenge open at all times? And what were the historical attempts and the analysis of those attempts? Focusing on the stylistics or the asalib of the Qur'an. What is in the Qur'an that makes it inimitable? What was the reaction of the first recipients? How did they respond to it? And is it just in Arabic language they have to meet this challenge or not? What was the understanding of the ulama of the past of this challenge? And what is the newer, novel understanding currently, as propounded by many ulama on this issue? Even the jinns, whether they were involved in meeting up this challenge or not. And we said we will talk about, as time permits, in later sessions, analyzing a specific attempt in modern times called the True Furqan, and also another surah, so-called surah called Surah Al-Nurayn. And we went through why was it necessary, why is it unique. There are lots of different challenges. There are direct and indirect challenges, and we talked about how there are challenges to do with willpower. Several examples I gave. Challenges to do with where people have to think and reflect, ponder and research, and based on that, whether they're able to meet up this challenge or not. Okay, you don't have to focus on this. Those of you who haven't been attending this session last time, it's on YouTube available in SC Dawa channel. We'll give you the link at the end, inshallah. There are challenges which were indirect, linked with someone's fate, like as you know about Abu Lahab, how the Qur'an actually said that he was going to go to hellfire, even long before he has gone to hellfire. Like he remained alive for another 10 years. He could have just simply said, I believe, and the challenge would have been wrong. The Quranic statement would have been wrong. But Allah knows, of course, this individual is destined for his own actions and belief to hellfire, and that's why, this is the indirect challenge linking with faith. We talked about how even indirectly about science, about the heart in a man's heart. Allah didn't place two hearts in a man, but obviously the words used are quite specific, because we know there are two hearts in a woman when she's pregnant. The Quran uses a very specific term, لِرَجُلٍ. And examples of how the whole community is supposed to be doing, meeting the challenge. If they're able to bring something like the fly, and if the fly were to snatch something away from it, they won't be able to retrieve it. And how is it that Allah can mention this? Like they would never be able, they won't be able to retrieve what the fly takes away from it. And we discussed at length what was the process. And about different knowledges that Allah says, you did not know this before. Anyone can come and just say, but I knew it. When the Qur'an said that you did not know this, and those who knew, they could have just said, but I knew it. They could have easily got the Qur'an proved to be wrong. And why we were unable to appreciate the challenge, because we don't understand the novelty the Qur'an introduced in its language, because we are so accustomed every day reading, listening the Qur'an, memorizing the Qur'an. But the first time when they listened during the time of revelation, it was a total different matter altogether. Now, in this session today, inshallah, we'll go through in more technical detail. So I apologize if it involves a lot of Arabic terms and particulars of Arabic language, because the Quran is in Arabic, and to understand the challenge of the Quran in Arabic, we have to understand some of these terms. Okay, so hopefully those of you who haven't learned Arabic at all, it will give you an inspiration, an encouragement to go and study Arabic and appreciate the Quran even more. That why the Quran is inimitable, why the Quran is not anyone's capacity to match it. So to move on, this is a book that I would recommend you to listen, because there's an audio available of this, as well as the book in English language, because hardly there is anything in English language on the subject of inimitability in depth, going through the methods and the principles and the application of this. Because what you have all is just examples here and there, how certain prepositions or particles, nouns and verbs and placements of sentences or ayat makes it very interesting, to say the least, when we talk about the Quranic ayah and the surahs. This book, specifically this one here in Arabic, is called Al-Mu'jiza by Bassam Sa'i. It's in 2 volumes. First volume is his methodology, in which he goes through the principles of we'll take all the questions later, inshallah, at the end, if you don't mind, because there's a lot to go through, and we'll sit down and go through all the questions later on. So there's an English version and there's an Arabic version of this available. So, did the people just sit there and do nothing when the Quran challenged them? Or there were people who wanted to take up this challenge? We know from our historical narrations, there were a few individuals like Abu al-Ala al-Ma'adhi, Ibn al-Muqaffa', Abu al-Tayyib, al-Mutanabbi. They tried to start, but they failed to begin. Now what does it mean? Because these people are very, in their literature, the masters of their languages, and they excelled in their proficiency of the language, whether it's poetry or literature and so on. And yet, they could not fulfill to meet the challenge. They could not even begin, even though they had this intention to do that. So we are talking about someone who is experts and proficient masters of Arabic language at different time periods, and they could not produce something like it. Compare this to this rhetoric, the polemics that we hear today. Some people don't even know how to speak Fusha Arabic, and they say, I can bring something like the Quran. There you go, there's something in the internet and so on. I mean, if you were to give them a piece of Arabic poetry from the pre-Islamic times, they didn't even know what to make of it. And let alone the Quran, which brings a novel meaning and approach to the Arabic language of the past, the present, or the future, as you will see as we demonstrate. So going through, who is the challenge directed to? Al-Quran yatahadda al-jinn ma'al-ins. So we have to understand that, the Quran didn't just leave the meeting up the challenge to poor humans only. Because there are many humans who think they know better, and they have resort to other spiritual domain where they can say, I can get the help of jinn or shayateen to bring something like it. The Quran says, doesn't matter. Whoever, if you seek besides Allah, ask your helpers, seek your helpers and support us beside Allah, you won't be able to. And we talked about the ayah of the Quran. Allah says, the whole of the mankind and the jinn, if they were to bring themselves together, come together, they won't be able to bring something like the Quran.
Even one ayah.
Was the challenge of the Qur'an temporal or eternal? Was it locally for that time or was it perpetual? هل كان التحدي موجها إلى العرب في عصر المبعث أو إنه قائم عبدا على امتداد الزمن? Is it all the time or only for that time? Yeah, because people often think maybe there are very expert Arabs or Muslims otherwise may be able to meet this challenge. The Quranic challenge, in a nutshell, is open to all times. But obviously, from what we understand, the proficiency of the Arabic language today compared to what they were proficient in, the Arabs, the Mushrikun at that time, we can't really compare them. I mean, how many do you know of Arabic speakers or experts who can bring something like even the Sha'r al-Jahili, and produce instantly, then and there, like they used to do in the market of Uqayas, like they used to do in the competition they used to have? You hardly find few. So we are talking about the Arabic language, the expertise in the language hasn't really been excelled in the sense like we do. Maybe there are individuals who are very, very good, but in general terms, across the globe, you can't really compare the times at that time compared to today. So if they were unable to match and bring something like the Qur'an, how can we even expect logically that they were able to match something today? It's illogical. Now, how novel, how new is this Quranic language, the Quranic surah, the Quran itself? I want to give you an example. Suppose I said the Quran is like an architecture, a building made up of bricks. Each brick is separated from each other, as you can see in the picture, floating in space. And some of the bricks are made of materials that we are familiar with. Others looks like it's made of whatever material it's made of, but actually in close inspection, it's not like that. It's not like a material that you've ever seen on Earth. Things is connecting itself to build. This is only one part of this picture zoomed in. But if you have a whole building, because you need rods and cement, you need lots of things to make a building, make an architecture, right? The connection between these things, the connection between the bricks to make into wall, the corners and the shapes, everything is different. And it's like this floating in space. Would you be able to bring a building like this? Like this building, each brick of its walls and ceilings floating in space. No architecture, no architect can bring a building like that, make a building like this. Quite obvious, because we don't have the technology to even have something floating like that, let alone a whole building and, stands on its own. So the Quranic challenge to understand that, if you understand the Quran came as a linguistic phenomenon in which its words, its connectivity by its conjunctions and particles and prepositions, the way it's constructed and everything all together in the linguistic units, smaller and bigger all together, it's totally new, yet it's in Arabic. Going backwards. So this is an example of the Arabic poetry that we are familiar with. Those of you who know, these are all the bihars, right? So you have al-basit, al-tawil, al-madid, al-kamil, al-wafir, al-rajas, al-ramal, al-hajaz, al-khafif, al-sari', and so on and so forth. Because Arabic poetry has certain rhymes and meters, okay? And these are, the mnemonics, how they are constructed. That's its rules. So when you want to bring an Arabic poetry, it falls under one of these 16, for example. And it has the specific patterns. The Quran is none of those. It falls, Quranic chapters or surahs falls none of these patterns. So it's unlike the Bihar that the Arabs were familiar with. Of course, now you have a free-form speech in Arabic language, whether they call it poetry or prose, whatever. But when it's the Quran we're talking about, it's a linguistic genre on its own. This is an example on your left-hand side on the screen of a surah, Surah Al-Muddathir. The whole surah fitted in one page. And on the right-hand side, you can hardly see apart from this ثم نظر. That is the only thing that is common to the Arabs at that time that they were familiar with. Everything else besides that, it was new, novel. Do you now understand what we're talking about, the novelty? We don't appreciate it because we read it constantly, we memorize it, we don't know. But if you look at, and as you go through what is within the structure, what within the stylistics of the Qur'an and its language that is novel, this is what we're talking about in the depth and breadth of the novelty or the newness in the Quranic language. It's not like asking how much new the Qur'an brought in the Arabic language. It's rather to ask how much is not new. Do you see that point? How much is not new? So in Surah Al-Muddathir, you have 256 words altogether. Total ayah is 56. These are different types of novelty phenomenon or newness. New constructions, and then we will go through in detail what we mean by this. 12 new constructions, 65 new expressions, 14 new words, new meaning to old words, 38, new terms, which are Islamic terms, 11, multidimensional words, 7, new usage of particles, 14, new concept of imagery, 31, iltifat or shifts, 15, open language, 29, conciseness of speech is 35. So if you now see it tabulated, total ayah, تراكيب الجديدة, تعبيرات الجديدة. So this is the تركيب, تعبير. I'll explain to you what it means later. ألفاظ الجديدة, ألفاظ القديم في معنى جديد, مصطلحات الإسلامية جديدة, الاستعمال الجديد للأدوات, and so on. These are the ayats on this column. And as you can see, hardly any column, any row missing of newness. Next page. Can you see? Hardly any column missing. For every single ayah, there's something new. So that is the extent. You don't have to go through just to show you visually what we mean by the breadth and the depth of novelty of the Quranic language, which the Arabs at that time, or even today, or in the future, is going to have to deal with. Okay? So as you can see, it took me about 6 or 7 slides to go through all of them, and you can see in every single line, there is a linguistic novelty phenomenon. What's interesting to understand, that it's not just in one surah. It's throughout the Qur'an in every single surah. There are more linguistic innovations or phenomenon than the total words within a surah. For examples here, Surah Al-Fatiha has 29 words altogether in this surah. The new phenomena is 58. Think about it. You read the surah every single day, 17 times a day. 58 new phenomena in the Arabic language that the Arabs of the pre-Islamic time were not familiar with. It's shocking. How is that so? So we will go through Surah Al-Fatiha, inshallah, towards the end, when the session comes to an end, to show you how Al-Fatiha is, as we say. Surah Al-Nas, 20 words in altogether. 33 phenomena, which are new. Surah Al-Falaq, 23 words with 38 new phenomena. Surah Al-Ikhlas, 15 words and 22 phenomena. Just giving you some examples, just to highlight that it is not just one surah of the Qur'an. We're talking about every single surah. So the author here, his second volume is application of his methodology, understanding this principle that he's derived by the research that he's done. And he goes through a lot of surahs which are shorter and a big surah as well, a large surah. And evidently demonstrates how the linguistic novelty exceeds the number of words within the surah. So we are talking about this amount and depth and breadth of linguistic newness. Just to introduce to you some of the concepts. When we talk about Quranic stylistics, we are going to focus on few things. There are 3 important things to understand. Tarkib, ta'bir, and sabika. Tarkib, the plural, which is tarakib. Ta'bir, ta'birat. Sabika, Saba'ik. Tarkib are constructions or verbal formulations which are not complete. 2, 3 words. 4 words. Ta'bir in this context refers to complete or near complete ideas and expressions. And sabika or patterns are more than 4 words within this linguistic unit. So we can break down the Quranic ayah to understand the novelty or the newness. Because remember, we're all trying to understand how the Quran is inimitable. Meaning that you cannot bring something like the Quranic ayah or a surah, let alone the whole Quran. So we have to understand what is it within the Quranic ayah, the language itself, that is a miracle. Because you cannot match it. So we are talking about the constructions, how the words, prepositions, particles come together to make a small linguistic unit, 3 words. How bigger expression, linguistic unit called expressions, and even bigger called sabika. Do you all understand this point? Yeah? You can ask and question, okay, fine, the Quran is innovative in its linguistic newness, but since when an innovation is a miracle? People can innovate, people can, waffle and just talk and, talk gibberish. That's an innovation in the language, right? If I started now speaking in tongues, that would be like a new form of words in my language. But is newness an innovation a miracle? How the Quranic newness or innovation is a miracle is to understand what we're talking about in terms of what this newness is about. The Quran's true distinctiveness lies not in its occasional breaking with the contemporary linguistic conventions, but in the consistently high frequency with which the breaks occur. Indeed, every single surah in the entire Quran contains more breaks with linguistic convention than the number of its words. So we are talking about that amount. And yet, even with this novelty, newness phenomena, it is understood because it's in Arabic language. When I see a building made up of bricks, even though the bricks are floating from each other, when I look at it, it's still a building. When they look and read and listen to the Quran, it's Arabic language, still the Quran in its main principle, core of the Arabic language itself. It doesn't deviate and bring a new Arabic rule altogether. So what this newness is, in terms of how it brings, we will learn as we go through. And fine, people may say, okay, fine, with these constructions there, the ayats of the Quran is eloquent, there's beauty, splendor, and precision of its expression. But how is it a miracle? It could be the works of a mere genius, right? There are lots of genius around who compose poetry, compose music, compose literature. It doesn't make it miracle. Why do you call it miracle? There are a lot of people, they can actually do a lot of things which you think like, wow, it's a genius, it's the works of a genius. But do we call that a miracle? But when it comes to the Quran, we are calling this new phenomenon a miracle. Why? Because miracle, by definition, is something that it surpasses the human capacity. You cannot do something like it. Okay? Fire is to burn. But if you go into the fire and it doesn't burn you, like Ibrahim alayhi salam was put in the fire, it's a miracle. Because the normal property of fire is to burn, heat. Yeah? Temperature, high temperature. But if you now actually see normal fire, it doesn't burn you, something's different happening here. So when we're talking about the miraculousness of the Quran, we are talking about the Quran is something that the human or the jinn, even if they came together, they're unable to imitate it. That's why it is not just the work of a genius. At the end, if you say, okay, I agree, I admit, confess, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he wrote the Quran, he's a genius. But no, that is not sufficient, because you will be bound to surrender to this concept that this is beyond human capacity, including Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his people at that time, people of today, people in the future. It is beyond human capacity to bring something like it. So, the miraculousness of the Qur'an lies in the very paradox. The paradox of its being truly Arabic and its being at the same time a new language. This might appear to be illogical. However, the logic of miracle inheres in precisely the fact that it surpasses logic. A miracle that rests on logic ceases to be a miracle. Let me give you an example of human styles to appreciate when we're talking about the divine style of the Qur'an. 5 examples here to show you how the human styles, whether it comes from the best poets and expert in the Arabic literature, they're not unique. These examples are from very well-known expert Arab linguists. Or you can say someone who is a master in their achievement in prose or poetry. But if you look at it, وَأَمَّا الْكِتَابُ فَجَمَعَ حِكْمَةً وَلَهْوًا. Do you know who wrote it? Anyone? وَإِنَّ هَذَا لَا يُوَلِّدُ مِنَ الْحُزْنِ وَالْأَسَفِ غَيْرَ قَلِيلٍ. Do we know who wrote it? From a famous writer. يبتدعون أساليب ومناهج في نظم الكلام. Do we know who wrote it? لا يخاف على ولده من اليتم. Do we know who's the author of these lines? ولكن الفن البياني يرتفع على ذلك. Now, these lines are by Ibn al-Muqaffa in his Qalila wa Dimna, Ibn Hazm, Taha Hussein, Al-Ma'arri, and Al-Rafi'. Famous, well-known experts in Arabic language. And yet we were unable to, and those of you listening, if you were to do this exercise, you would not know whose statement is which. But if you were to mix Quranic statements, Quranic ayah, part of it, complete, in anywhere, in any literature, it stands out. How so? Because of the Quranic structure and stylistics. And these are what we're going to go in more detail. Yeah. So the Quran, Jazakallah khairan, maybe I'll do this if it doesn't work. The Quran itself has the unique character. So does the surah, so does the ayah. You'll be surprised to know and hear that the word Quran was not a word that the Arabs of the time of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam and before was familiar with. They didn't know this term Qur'an. They knew Qira'ah. They didn't know Qur'an. Surah. They had no concept of a surah. They had surah like a citadel, a city wall, not surah. Ayah, as in ayah of the Qur'an, they were not familiar with these concepts. So even when we're talking about the very Qur'an itself, the surah itself, the ayah of it, the whole book and its chapters and its sentences are unique. It's a new term that was introduced in the Arabic repertoire, in their linguistics. And yet, even though there were new terms, but they did not find themselves at a loss understanding what they are. Because these were explained by the Quran as it was introduced within the Quran. So if you look at the how termed Quran and Surah, it was needless. There was no need to define what it is. Even though the Quran brought this new term, it defined it as it went, explaining it. So when the Quran is recited, then listen to it and pay attention that you may receive mercy. Surah number 7, ayah 204. Quran is recited. This is something that's recited. So he's introducing to you that this is something that is recited already. And those who disbelieve say, why was this Quran not revealed to him all at once? So when the Arabs, the first times, the mushrikun, when they listened to it, They knew it's referring to this, what Muhammad ﷺ brought as a kitab, as a book, even though the term was unfamiliar to them. So this is how the Qur'an introduces new language, and yet it is not something that they were grasping to understand what it is. If a child speaks gibberish, you don't know what it means. You don't understand that language. But the Qur'an came in this language, in the Arabic language, with all its novelty and newness. They were able to understand it. Surah. The term surah. The hypocrites are apprehensive lest a surah be revealed about them, informing them of what is in their hearts. This is a surah which we have sent down and made obligatory and revealed therein ayat of clear evidence that you might remember. These are the ayat of Allah which we recite to you, O Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in truth. See, these are the Quranic translation of the meaning of the Quranic ayah and how they're introducing the term ayah and surah. And we know what it refers to, even though they had no concept of what it meant. But the Qur'an did not leave it to their own thinking. It actually demonstrated the novelty with clarity at the same time. Novelty and clarity. When we go and understand each surah on itself, this is where the shock comes. Why is a surah different than any other piece of work? You will see that each surah of the Qur'an, as you now go and read and understand and reflect on, they're unique. There are distinct and distinctive overall rhythm and rhyme within surahs, but hardly the characteristics of surahs in the Qur'an overlap. Surah Al-A'la and Surah Al-Layl, 87 and 92. وَاللَّيْلِ إِذَا يَغْشَى. Yeah. And what's the other? Surah Al-Sabbih Isma Rabbika Al-A'la, Yaghsha. You might think there is something common, but if you go through in detail, you will see that this new literary form, the art of the Quranic surah that Quran introduced, it was unlike Fannul Khataba, Sajal Kahan, Fannul Rasail, Fannul Sha'r. Okay, without translating, these are technical terms to deal with different type of speech in Arab language. Whether it's speech of a poetry or a prose, or the speech of a soothsayer or an orator and so on, right? It was not like any of their speech. If we compare Surah 87 and Surah 92, it appears that they have rhythmic similarities in both the surahs. Like there are similar number of words in the surah. Al-A'la is 72 words and Al-Layl has 71 words. So surah looks very similar, right, in terms of number of words within it. The ayah endings mostly are in the pattern of fa'ala, a'la, and so on, right? There are some few words that are shared between this surah: khalaqa, ashqa, yasla, al-akhirah, rabba, al-a'la. But that's where the similarity ends. They do not have even a single expression or constructs in common between them. Out of 26 expressions, 22 expression or constructs in Surah Al-A'la, and remaining 4 appears elsewhere but not in Surah Al-Layl. Out of 25 expressions or constructs in Surah Al-Layl, the other surah, 22 of them are unique to that surah, and remaining 3 appears elsewhere but not Surah Al-A'la. That's the differences between them. The surah itself has its own persona. You would notice the break and disturbance in general rhythm if you were to mix something from one surah to another surah. You might not notice it because you read it constantly. So, I'll give you an example from Surah Al-Taha and Surah Al-Baqarah in these ayat, 77 to 78 in Taha and ayah 51 this must be a misprint. Within this ayah, it will be clear in the Arabic part. It's talking about how Musa alayhi salam, how he parted the sea with his staff, and how he was safely taken to a place of safety, and the pharaohs and his people drowned. Listen carefully. So this is one surah. As you can see, there is a sound note and rhythm within the ayat consecutively. We'll hear the other surah. Okay, just pause for there. So this is another surah which talked about the same incident. But you can see how even when you listen to it, it's a different kind of rhymes and rhythm and the sound note to it. However, the subject matter is the same. If we were to place the middle ayah from the first one into one of this, it remains the same meaning throughout. But notice the disturbance of the naghma, the sound note, the rhythm, the pattern, that you hear. So if you were concentrating from the beginning, the middle, and the end, you would have noticed suddenly there's a shift in the middle. And the last ayah matched the first one. So what we introduced was this middle ayah from the other surah. So if you were to concentrate, and you will see that suddenly there's like a shift of tones. It doesn't belong here. This is how you would feel. So those of you who are into this deep reflection on listening, you immediately notice there's a pattern that's different. There's this, it doesn't belong. You will feel that way. So that's what we're talking about. Each surah is unique in its own persona. You cannot overlap each other, mix each other, and see that it's what we call like the same. It doesn't appear to be. Now the surah, they have unique characteristics. As I mentioned to you, the word surah comes from sur, which means the city wall, which means like a citadel. What do the city wall used to do, like a citadel used to do? So that it's impenetrable. You can't penetrate these walls. Like how the enemy cannot come in the city. That's how these walls will protect the citizen inside. So surah was like this, that it's protecting itself. The Quranic surah itself, each surah is impenetrable. You cannot make something like this surah. That's how it's protected. And how so? Just look at the differences that the Quranic surah is compared to the Arabic speech, whether it's poetry at that time, how they were bringing their poetry, their forms of speech, and how they're accustomed to. 29 surahs began with disjointed letters. Huruf al-muqatta'at, like alif lam mim, alif lam ra, yasin. Totally unique to them. The Arabs at that time they had no understanding of how, because you know how the Mufassirin trying to explain like there is something, but you will not find any whatsoever you can search, nowhere that the Arabs were ever bringing their forms of speech or poetry, bringing with this kind of disjointed letters. 15 surahs begins with oaths. Qasam. وَاللَّيْلِ إِذَا يَغْشَى وَاللَّيْلِ. It's a qasam. وَالتِّينِ وَالزَّيْتُونِ. The Arabic poetry or the forms of speech, they don't bring something like, they don't begin with these kind of oaths. 14 surahs begins with past tense, and 12 of this past tense indicates present. Let's reflect on it. It begins with a past tense, but it actually indicates is a present or even a future tense, and not a past tense. Like we say, Ata amrullah, Ata amrullahi fala tasta'jilu. It's in the past tense. The command of Allah has come, but actually it refers to the command of Allah is coming in the future, even though it says it's in the past. 10 surahs begins with a distinctive Quranic vocative form, Ya ayyuha. This is not how the Arabs would begin their work. There are 7 surahs which begins with an adverb denoting future, dharf, mustaqbil, like idha. But the condition, sorry, these are quite technical, but so just bear with me to understand what we're talking about in terms of the language itself. Even though it's a dharf mustaqbil is an adverb which denotes something of a future, the condition is not necessarily present there, okay, which is absent. Condition which is necessary, it's absent, and it doesn't denote a conditional sentence anyway, because normally when you say either, then you make it like, or if this, then that. But this is not the case. Instead, it can refer to what will happen in the future or in the past. For example, إِذَا الشَّمْسُ كُوِّرَتْ. When the sun is wrapped up, it talks about that the sun will be wrapped up in the future. It's not a conditional sentence that the Arabs were familiar with in their speech. So this form of expression is totally new. It means the sun will be wrapped up in the future, even though it's using the expressions which denotes normally in their understanding of a conditional statement. Or إِذَا جَاءَكَ الْمُنَافِقُونَ, when the hypocrites come to you. But actually this refers to something that the hypocrites already came. It refers to an action of the past. It's not a conditional statement. There are 4 surahs who begins with the particle of emphasis when we talk about adat al-tawqid, inna, but it's connected with the plural pronoun na, with a meaning in a singular for Allah, like inna fatahna laka fatham mubina. This is not how they use. There are 3 surahs which begins with an ayah which comprises of only one word. Ar-Rahman, Al-Haqqa, Al-Qari'ah. One word. Whole sentence. This is totally new to them. How do you begin a sentence with just one word? 2 surahs begins with the lam of negation or la of negation, but it has a meaning of affirmation. La uqsimu. Literally, it means something like, I don't make oath. But yet the oath is made. There are 2 surahs which begins with qad, the assertive qad, but unlike how the Arabs were used to in employing this, they used to say laqad, but the Quran says qad. The Quran says laqad aflaha al-mu'minun, says qad aflaha al-mu'minun, or qad sami'a. You would normally say laqad. There are two surahs which begins with the interrogative hal, but with a meaning of affirmation rather than a question. Normally you say hal with a question, right, in Arabic language. But here, هل أتى على الإنسان حين من الدهر لم يكن شيئا مذكورا. It doesn't mean a question, it's affirming. هل أتاك حديث الغاشية. It's not a question that have they come to you. Actually, the news have already come to you. There are 6 surahs who begins with the glorification and praises for Allah or the command for the like thereof. This particular stylistics was totally unknown to the Arabs before Islam, like Alhamdulillah alladhi anzala ala abdihi al-kitab, or Subhan alladhi asra bi abdihi laylan min al-masjid al-haram ila akhiri. Sabbih isma rabbika al-a'la. So this kind of glorification with Sabbaha, Alhamdulillah, the Arabs were not accustomed to this at all. Totally new to them. Can you imagine this shock? As we go through and develop this, you will see what we're talking about. 5 surahs begins with a singular imperative قل قل أعوذ برب الفلق قل هو الله أحد قل أعوذ برب الناس قل يا أيها الكافرون. These things are totally unique to them even in their linguistic stock. They don't begin their works like this. A surah begins with an infinite form, the verbal noun we call masdar. Tanzilul kitab. You don't begin your sentences with a masdar. You have jumla ismiya, jumla fa'iliya, yes? Nominal sentence, verbal sentence, jumla insha'iyya, with a masdar. A surah begins with a relative pronoun. الذين كفروا, with الذين. A surah begins with interrogative hamza, as in أرأيت الذي يكذب بالدين, with a meaning of informing and not questioning. It is actually informing them. Have you not seen those who denied the resurrection? It's not asking a question with the hamza. So you now see the surahs, how they are unique in its construction. If we now go to the ayah of the Qur'an, how does the Qur'an end the ayah? The Quranic endings of the ayah, we call them fasila. Yeah? It is different from what we know from saja in prose or qafiya in poetry. The Quranic fasila has its own rules. It is not like what you have in prose or in poetry. The Quranic fasila, it ends at the end of an ayah, no matter how long the ayah is. It could be one word, it could span whole page, unlike the qafiyah of your poetry or the saja. While the saja of Arabic writing must end in short sentences, no matter what, most of the time it spans only a few words. And you know some of the ayah of the Qur'an go one page. Ayat al-Dain is like a whole one page. Majority of the Quranic fasila comes in an elongated endings like Azim, Qadir, Sabila, and many of these ends with the letters like Noon and something like this, yeah? Zalimun. Most surahs have a primary fasila, but the surah then moves into various other fasila in between and returns to the primary one. Surah Baqarah is one of the longest surah. Its primary fasila, the endings of the ayah, is like Un, In, Im. But sometimes Ud, Id, or Il. We see the Ir in those ayat, 106, 108 to 10, 120, 148, 270. We see the fasila like Ab in ayats 165 to 6, 196 to 7, and various other ayah, as well as Aq, Ar, Ad in other ayat. So even though there are different fasilas, different kind of endings, unlike your poetry or prose, the construction they have, the Quranic ayah has its own meter and its own rhyme. The letter is not the cornerstone of the Quranic fasila. It's not based on the letter itself at the end. So you will see that how some of the poetries, they have ra or noon, yep, or lam. كيف نبكي من ذكرى حبيب ومنزلي بسقط اللواء بين الدخول فحوملي, ends with lam. This is Imrul Qais' poetry. The Quran, the letters are not important. It's not the cornerstone. But it can still end in an ayah, and it has rhymes. And it has own meters. Rather, as we say, unlike the saj'a, it's based on the sound note and meter, and al-naghma and al-wazn. The letter has not much of a value in this case. For example, in Baqarah, in ayah 200 to 202, it ends with laq, nar, sab. It's different. All of which have the same meter and rhyme, though it ends with different letters. The Quran came to reconfigure the linguistic unit. So when we talk about an ayah of the Quran versus a clause or a jumla in the traditional Arabic sense, or a bayt or a stanza in the Arabic sense, the Quran came and reconfigured those linguistic units. Now, these are just two ayats, part of these two ayats of the Quran. وَأَنزَلَ التَّوْرَاةَ وَالْإِنْجِيلَ مِنْ قَبْلُ هُدًى لِلنَّاسِ وَأَنزَلَ الْفُرْقَانَ إِنَّ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا بِآيَاتِ اللَّهِ لَهُمْ عَذَابٌ شَدِيدٌ. The first ayah ends with, it is he who has bestowed from on high the Torah and the Injil, the Gospel. But the meaning is not complete yet. The next ayah, min qablu hudan linnas, min qablu hudan linnas. So if you were to traditional way of understanding the text, you would say, وَأَنزَلَ التَّوْرَاةَ وَالْإِنْجِيلَ مِنْ قَبْلُ هُدًى لِلنَّاسِ. That would have been like one jumla, one sentence. But the Quranic ayah ends differently. In fact, it begins, if you look at the second ayah, verse 4, min qabl. So, aforetime, as a guidance unto mankind. And it is He who has bestowed upon man the standard by which to discern the true from the false. Behold, as for those who are bent on denying God's message, grievous suffering awaits them. Now, even that ayah, it could have finished Hudal linnas or وَأَنزَلَ الْفُرْقَانَ. But look at it. إِنَّ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا بِآيَاتِ اللَّهِ لَهُمْ عَذَابٌ شَدِيدٌ. Those who disbelieve in the ayats of Allah, there's terrible punishment for them. That itself is a complete sentence. A sentence is a meaningful expression of words. But that's only a part of this ayah. So the Quranic ayah is totally different from the traditional understanding of a jumla or a bayt in Arabic language. So when it came, it reconfigured. So no wonder the Arabs were thinking like, what is it? I mean, where does the ayah end? Ar-Rahman. Oh, that's one ayah. Or whole of Ayatul Dain, Ayatul Kursi. They are perplexed into the linguistic genre that the Quran is now bringing to them. So we talked about this, how the min qabl. Yep. So if you were to see another example, Surah Al-Rum, Alif Lam Mim, غُلِبَتُ الروم في أدنى الأرض وهم من بعده غلبهم سيغلبون. So Alif Lam Mim, defeated have been the Byzantines in the land close by. Yeah. Remember the ayat, if you look at the Quranic ayat, verse 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, where there's a double stroke, that's where you would normally end your normal sentence in ordinary Arabic language. But the Quran has its own way of ending. And it doesn't lose its appeal, its eloquence, its beauty, its majesty, its openness, its conciseness, its precision. That's what we're talking about, reconfiguring totally the linguistic units. If you talk about the conjunctions, using how the conjunctions connects words together, connects phrases together, connects sentences together. This is an ayah of the Quran. if you were to break this down, if you go to the next slide, that is what we're talking about. The conjunction that you're supposed to see, it's hidden. So it would have been something like this if in a traditional Arabic language. أَفَهَكَذَا يَكُونُ مَنْ هُوَ قَائِمٌ عَلَى كُلِّ نَفْسٍ بِمَا كَسَبَتْ وَقَدْ جَعَلَ اللَّهُ شُرَكَاءَ فَقُلْ لَهُمْ سَمُّوهُمْ, and so on. The words in the brackets are something that's not in the Qur'an. But that's the words that the Qur'an doesn't even need to have, and yet the meanings are expressed without these conjunctions. So Qur'an connects with hidden conjunctions which are not even there. So how can you bring something like these kind of things? How do you bring something like it? The question is, because the Qur'an is omitting all of this and yet it's meaningful and it's precise, yet it is something very expressive. So they would normally speak like this. So we'll go as more and more examples to see how you won't be able to bring something like it, even with these constructions. So the traditional Arabic mold in poetry starts something like this. وَمَنْ يَكُوا ذَا وَإِنِّي إِمْرُؤٌ إِنْ أَلَا هَلْ أَتَأَنَّ أَلَا لَيْتَ شِعْرِي هَلْ أَبِتَنَّ لَيْلَةً. Some of the examples here. If you go into the next slide. So these are how they begin their poetry. These are the linguistic traditional molds. So that's how the Arabs are used to in the expression of their poetry. Do you see anything similar in the Qur'an? وَإِنِّي إِمْرُؤٌ إِنْ خَلِيلَيَّ مُرَّ بِي يَا صَاحِبَيَّ تَلَوَّمَا. You've never read this in the Qur'an. So the Qur'an came in its beginning of expressions, but it introduced none of these. So if you carry on, just to give you some example of poetry, okay? I'm not going to give you two meanings, just to understand the structure, right? وَلَيْلٍ كَمَوْجِ الْبَحْرِ. So if you see that these are the patterns of the poetry, the first 4 lines is by Imrul Qais. Hatem al-Tay is this one here. Yeah? How is this constructed? You can actually formulate the construction. It starts with a mubtada. In Arabic language, when you have a nominal sentence, you have a mubtada and you have a khabar. Yeah? The noun and its predicate. So you have a mubtada, which is the mushabbaha, which is the one that you're making the similarity with. It's usually then connected with a majroor, lafzan with waw, like wa laylin, yeah, wa kharqin, wa khaylin. You can see wow, it starts. Then it has a khabar which is kaf with a meaning of likeness, like wa laylin ka mawjin, ka alwahin, ka dhahrin. See, ka. The ka is for like. Then it is connected in mudaf with ismul mushabbaha, which is a mudaf. But that itself is a mudaf. You know, mudaf mudaf ilayhi, those who are learning Arabic language, like my book is a mudaf ilayhi construction. It's possessors, okay? A possessive. That itself, the second part, is mudaf to another word, ismul mushabbaha, which is mudaf ilayhi. And that finishes what is compared to. And then it finishes with what? Failun madi, which is a past tense. As you can see here, all of this past tense with a damir, which goes back to the mubtada, the noun. All of this are in this pattern. You can clearly deconstruct this poetry. Another example, poetry by Tarafat al-Abd, Al-Asha, Nabigha, Majnoon Layla, and you can see إذا أنت لم إذا أنت لم إذا أنت لم إذا أنت لم إذا أنت لم. How it starts, similar kind of traditional mold. That's how you begin, and the patterns they were similar again. There you can actually construct it, how it's formulated. Same again, another example for other. There's no point going in detail, just to show you. But the Quranic linguistic templates is unlike their poetry, unlike their poetical patterns, unlike their expressions that they're familiar with. It has its own nature and it has its own compositions, the Quranic templates. We just carry on a few more minutes, a few more examples. Yeah. And the Quranic templates of these expressions and so on, they're irreplaceable. You can't replace it. But with the poetry that you've seen, you can replace it with a construction and bring another poem like that with the same construct. This is an example of a part of the Quranic ayat. وَلَا تَزِرُ وَازِرَةٌ وِزْرَ أُخْرَى. No bearer of sins can bear the sin of another. If someone was to say, look, you know what, I'm the manager of a company and I want to tell my employees that, you know, no one will bear the burden of task of someone else. Everyone to do their own duty for an encouragement. You don't have to worry about someone else. And he says, I'm going to use the Quranic pattern, Quranic construct, and maybe just use a different word, but use the same pattern. Hamala means to carry, right? So I want to say, no person will carry the burden of someone else. And use this pattern. وَلَا تَحْمِلُ حَامِلَةٌ حِمْلَ أُخْرَى. If you're an Arab, you would laugh at this construction, because even though this is similar in the patterns, it is a laughable construct. Hamila is usually referring to what? A pregnant woman. Okay? This doesn't work. You simply cannot use this linguistic pattern the Quran introduced and replace it with something similar. That is why we were talking about that it's not inimitable. You can't replace it. The patterns are so unique. Only the Quran, the words that are used, the construct that are used, is only applicable there. It's not applicable anywhere else. Change the words. It doesn't work. Becomes a laughable construct, meaningless construct. A slightest change in the Quranic pattern or template will cause it to lose its meter. And in fact, there are as many meters as there are Quranic linguistic patterns. These meters are not based on vowels and non-vowel consonants, as they are in regular prosody, nor are they based on human rules that govern the arrangement and homogeneity of letters. In fact, the Quranic patterns of which we speak deviate from these rules on innumerable occasions. Yet, this very deviation renders them all the more fluid and masterful. So I'll give you some examples. If you open up a page in the Quran, say at the beginning, Surah Al-Baqarah, that we read so often. سواء عليهم أأنذرتهم أم لم تنذرهم لا يؤمنون. Surah Al-Baqarah, yeah? وَلَهُمْ عَذَابٌ عَظِيمٌ. You've read this before. وَمِنَ النَّاسِ مَن يَقُولُ آمَنَّا وَمَا هُمْ بِمُؤْمِنِينَ. You've read them. You're reading them every day. This is the divine construct, the pattern and the construction that Allah has used in the Quran. If you were to now use a human form of this construct, what it means, this is what you will say. إِنَّ إِنْ ذَرَتْ لَهُمْ أَوْ عَدَمَهُ سَيَّانٍ فَإِنَّهُمْ لَا يُؤْمِنُوا عَلَى أَيَّةِ حَالٍ. Instead of سَوَاءٌ عَلَيْهِمْ أَنذَرْتَهُمْ لَمْ تُنذِرْهُمْ لَا يُؤْمِنُونَ. That is what you normally say in Arabic language. وَلَهُمْ عَذَابٌ عَظِيمٌ. You won't say that. You would say rather, وَسَوْفَ نُعَذِّبُهُمْ بِشِدَّةٍ. That's what you would say in the Arabic language. وَمِنَ النَّاسِ مَن يَقُولُ آمَنَّا. You would say يَدَّعِي وَيُدَّعِي يَدَّعِي بَعْضُ النَّاسِ أَنَّهُمْ آمَنُوا. This is what you would say. This is the expression you would use. وَمَا هُمْ بِمُؤْمِنِينَ. You say وَالْحَقِيقَةُ أَنَّهُمْ لَمْ يُؤْمِنُوا وَالْحَقِيقَةُ أَنَّهُمْ يَخَادِعُونَ أَنفُسَهُمْ مِنْ غَيْرِ أَنْ يُدْرِكُوا ذَلِكَ. This is the human construct. When we say فِي قُلُوبِهِمْ مَرَضٌ فَزَادَهُمُ اللَّهُ مَرَضًا. Normal language you'd say فَزَادَ اللَّهُ مَرَضَهُمْ. That's how you use the construct. So this, if you were to now change this and make it something like I want to use this construct it is not going to work. Some examples I've shown you already, and some examples I'll show you in a second. So, some more, like when you say, بِمَا كَانُوا يَكْذِبُونَ, we're talking about in the same page of the Qur'an, in Surah Al-Baqarah. These constructs, unlike what the Arabs are used to, Arabs are familiar with, you will say rather, جَزَاءَ كَذِبِهِمْ وَإِذَا قِيلَ لَهُمْ لَا تُفْسِدُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ. Qur'an. But in human construct, in language that the Arabs would use, even today, you would normally say, وَإِذَا تُلِبَ مِنْهُمْ أَلَّا يُخَرِّبُوا وَيُخَرَّبُوا يخرب عيش الناس. Like وَإِذَا قِيلَ لَهُمْ آمِنُوا كَمَا آمَنَ النَّاسِ وَإِذَا تُلِبَ مِنْهُمْ. You see how the language is different. This is what we're talking about the Qur'an. We don't really realize that how the construct is different. If you were to speak in normal language, do you speak like this in your ordinary language? With your friends, with your family, with your colleagues? You don't. Why so? Because if you were to use this language, they will say like, are you reading Qur'an to me? Because the Qur'an is this form, this pattern, this construct, unique in itself. You can't use these Quranic patterns and constructs and expressions in ordinary language. Some more examples. Let's carry on. Now, Man dhal ladhi. The Quran uses man dhal ladhi. You would say manil ladhi. Ba'da idh. You would say ba'da an. That's how you would use your Arabic language. If you were to use ba'da idh, they will say like you've got it wrong. If you're an Arabic teacher, you probably mark it wrong. But when it's applied in the Quran, in that construct, within the ayah, eloquent. So how is it then that the Quranic construct is so different than the human construct? It's because the human language that the Arabs spoke then and speaks today in the Fusha, it has its own patterns, it has its own repertoire of expressions and constructs and stylistics which does not merge or overlap with the Quran. The Quran is unique. Carry on. More? More? Okay, carry on. Yep. Now, suppose now someone wants to try it out anyway. Let us now make some ordinary speech in the patterns of the Quranic construct and see how it feels. I give you an example about using hamala from the verb wazara. Few examples here. If somebody said, ثم أنت هذا تأتي لتزورنني. Am I speaking Somali? Ajami? Turkmeni? But this is the construct of this. ثم أنتم هؤلاء تقتلون أنفسكم. Perfect, eloquent, beautiful Arabic in the Quranic ayah, Quranic construct. But when you see this, مما أخطأك وقع لك ما وقع. Are you speaking Arabic? I mean, you are Arab themselves, you will say, what are you talking about? But this is a construct. 4. مما خطيئاتهم أغرقوا. In the Quran, if you replace it, the same construct, and use it in the language, this is how funny it becomes. This is how alien it sounds, even this Arabic. So I was saying, ثم أنت هذا تأتي لتزورنني. This is an uslub the Arabs were not familiar with in the past or at present times. But we read this without even realizing that this strangeness of it when we read the ayah every time. When you hear someone saying, لا تفرق بين أحد من تلامذتك, we will find ourselves like going and correcting it, then saying, no, that's not it. What you actually mean, بين الواحد والآخر من التلامذة. This is how you would write. You will correct it. But have you not read Quranic ayah? لا نفرق بين أحد من رسله. This is the Quranic construct. Using that construct with something like this, we don't make any difference between the students in a class using that form, you would say, oh no, that's not right. You will correct it. Another example. If you wanted to choose between two books, a small or a big one, and you chose a big one, and you said, وَعْجِبْتُ بِالْكِتَابِ الْكَبِيرِ غَيْرِ الصَّغِيرِ. Go to a bookshop and say something like this. They'll say, they'll say actually, well, you're probably learning Arabic. What you meant to say is, what you intend is, وَلَيْسَ الصَّغِيرِ, not غَيْرِ الصَّغِيرِ. Even though we read in our salah, how many times? 17 times every day at least. صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. This is the construct in the Qur'an. Using that construct in a bookshop, I don't know how they will laugh, or they will say, you know what, maybe I need to tell you that this is a section of Arabic language where you're going to buy the books to learn Arabic. The Qur'an comes with new words. What do you mean by new words? It's Arabic language. Are they bringing new words altogether? Then how would they even know? The new words comes in these 5 forms. The words which are already known to them, but now has a new meaning that could be understood in the siyaq, the linguistic, or the historical, rhetorical context. So when the Quran puts it in the context, the word which was known, but now they know this is a different meaning. Yeah, we'll give you some examples of this in a second. It also comes with new etymological derivations, new forms which the Arabs were unfamiliar with. Arabs have certain forms in a particular word. For example, you can have forms of, if you were to have a verb, in one way, and various forms that goes into patterns of the verbs. But some words, they didn't even use this form at all. They don't use it, because you can actually make a particular in this pattern. But the Quran brought this new etymological derivations. It also brings new technical, istilahi, technical meanings of terms, like salah, zakah. It has different meanings in the Arabic language, but technically we know what they mean. Even the zakah means purification. Did you pay your zakah means, did you pay your purification? No, you mean zakah, that you pay. It brings words which are unfamiliar in the roots, but they're actually deducible in the meaning from the linguistic context. And they're allegorical and figurative meanings that are new from the known meanings already present in the Arabic stock of the Arabic language. So some examples, the first category. The Arabs knew these words, but the Quran introduced them in their meanings in a rhetorical and a linguistic context, like sultan, dunya, kitab, yanzurun, yuqaddir. Yep. So the words which are etymologically different, like taghut, jahiliya, hadu, furqan, raqim, illiyun. Words which became a technical terms like dhikr, masajid, ajr, hasana. Each one has a technical meaning, but in the Arabic language it has a different meaning. So for example, dhikr is specifically the Islamic remembrance of dhikr when you do dhikr. But dhikr means what? Just to remember anything. But when you say, are you doing dhikr? What do they mean? What do they understand? They would understand you're doing tasbih and tahleem. Yeah? So the Quran uses these new technical meanings. Yeah? Words which are not known previously and they were unfamiliar, but the linguistic context made it easy for them to deduce the meanings. And these are mostly the Arabized forms coming from different languages like Farsi and Greek and Abyssinian, Nabatean, Syriac, Hebrew, Coptics, like Sirat, like Ab, Barzakh, Sijil, Qamtarir, Abariq, Qistas. Okay? So Quran uses this in the roots of Arabic language. So when people say, but are you saying these are different language? No. It's Arabized within the Arabic roots, Arabic language. Even though it is from a different language, but Arabized within the Arabic roots, so it's still Arabic. Because the Quran says, the Quran is revealed in the Arabic, pure Arabic, Arabiyyun Mubin. Yeah. And then we say the figurative meaning of different words, like kufr. Kufr, kafara, kafir. Kufr to means just to cover, right? But now when you say kufr, it doesn't mean just to cover. It's to actually disbelieve something in that category. Someone has done kufr. Act of kufr is not just act of covering a soil like a farmer does. Say the example of al-huda, guidance, al-dalala, taqwa, ummah, the libas. Yeah? So, perhaps they knew the word liqa, but they didn't know tilqa. Perhaps they knew the word kadhalik with a fatha, kadhalika, but they didn't know kadhaliki. They knew haula'i, but they did not know ha'um. They know ulaika, but not ulaikum. It's not to be found in the Arabic stock. Arabic, when we talk about Arabic stock, we're talking about pre-Islamic poetry, as we mentioned. Pre-Islamic poetry, Jahiliyyah, the Arabs, as they speak the language, this is not how they are familiar with. They haven't used any of it. Thousands of lines of Arabic poetry that has come down to us, you will not find any example of these usages. Qur'an brings these new usages. They knew about ittaqa, but not at-taqwa. They knew about al-haya, but not hayawan. They knew about al-alam, but didn't know about al-alameen. It's just a different form. But they have totally unfamiliarity with it. So when we're talking about the Quran introduces these words, if you carry on, just to give you lots of examples like shukr, they knew, but not shukur. Yeah? They knew about kabir, al-kabir, not al-kubbar. It's a new form. Yeah. Yeah. Carry on. Not only words are introduced anew, fresh, and they are now being bombarded. They have been now totally immersed in this newness of words. But not only words, interconnectivity of words. How the words are introduced. Maliki Yawmiddin. Surah Al-Fatiha, right? What's so strange about it? I'll tell you what's so strange about it. Malik means owner, master, king. Malik and Malik. Yawm means just a day. Deen means religion. It could mean recompense. Now, the Arabs, they understand what being Malik of. You're Malik al-Bayt. Yeah? Malik al-Sayyara. You're the owner of a house. You're owner of a car. You are owner of a horse. You're owner of a spear. You're an owner of this. You're owner of that. You own things. Material possessions or these possessions. But in their imaginations, in their linguistic stock, in their vocabulary, they never have this understanding or even imagination that you can be an owner of time. Can anyone be the owner of time? So when they heard the Maliki Yawm, what is this? Owner of time. No one owns time. You can't even use such a language. What are you talking about? Owning time. Not only that, as they were trying to get from this shock, Maliki Yawmiddin, the owner of time of religion. You don't say owner of time of religion. Deen is normally a religion, that's how they understood it. But the Quran uses a different understanding here. Deen means jaza, recompense. So that's the interconnectivity we're talking about, where it's total new phenomena to them. It's like giving them a shock one after the other in this newness, in this new phenomenon. When the Quran introduces the images, surah, it has its own repertoire of images. If you think about the traditional Arabic imagery, you know how the Arabs give examples of tashbih. They make similarity of something, a simile, a parable. Like, say, someone is a brave, they will say he's like a lion. We say that in English too, right? He's like a lion. Someone who's a coward, they will say he's an ostrich. Someone who's generous will say he's like a sea. A camel will be someone who's like resentful. Yeah? Someone who's somber, they'll say he's like a mountain. They will say it's like, she's like a moon or a sun. Beautiful. Yeah? And if you're very refined, they'll say it's like a star. And if you're very gentle and meek, they'll say he's like a lamb. Even the English and other people, they say, he's like a lamb, right? A lamb to the slaughter, like very gentle and meek. These are the imageries that the Arabs in their traditional language they're familiar with. And these are some expressions about a black hair, they will compare that to a night. Gray hair to a daytime. Mouth to daisies, teardrops to pearls, forehead to arrows. That's how the imagery that the Arabs would use in their poetry and in their language and speech. The Quranic imagery is unlike that. The Quranic imagery is not like this at all. For example, وَلَكُمْ فِي الْقِصَاصِ حَيَاءٌ. Ya ulil albab, this is how the ayah ends. For in this law of just retribution, there is life for you. So there is this law and there is haya. Where's the comparison? How is it like the comparison? It's like totally like, what are you talking about? You have this qisas, laws of retribution, and there is life for you. You need to really reflect and understand. Life for life. It's not like, you comparing to an animal or something like this or this. Totally different. ضَوْفَ الطَّالِبُ وَالْمَطْلُوبُ. How indeed the seeker is weak and so is the one who what is sought. And I'll give you an example of this later on. The seeker and the sought. What's the difference between them? But if you actually look at this in the context, you will say, look at the imagery that are used. Totally unique, totally different. It opens up your mind and, it's like ethereal dimension. In a different dimension altogether in this imagery. Not only this imagery as like this, it doesn't give you imagery something which are totally false in reality. It uses something that is real and uses these examples from reality while remaining true to reality. But in poetry, people say, I have a poetic license to tell something which is like unreal, totally like, oh, you're like bread. No one's like bread. But when people are so hungry, they say, oh, you see the sun and the moon, it's like a nice piece of bread, or a nice piece of khubz, or something like, chapati. That's what they see. But the moon is not made of flour. It's not chapati. So the Quran doesn't use, if you now go and reflect on the Quranic imagery, you will see how different they are. And that's why the Quran introduced hundreds and hundreds of imagery which are new. It broadened and it enriched and improved the repertoire of imagery. Another example, لا تدركه الأبصار وهو يدرك الأبصار. No vision can comprehend him, but he comprehends all vision. Look at the image that is used. You cannot comprehend, no human can encompass him, but Allah encompasses everything. Just think about it, like how long you have to think and reflect and to understand these dimensions of this imagery. You cannot comprehend Allah. Allah comprehends everything. You cannot comprehend Him at all. No vision can encompass Him. Look at the subtlety of this imagery. Carry on. This was in Surah Al-Muddassir, but it's too difficult to read, so we'll pass on. Yeah, carry on. This is an imagery about a fly. Allah gives a parable, an example. A fly. O people, an example is put forward. So listen to it carefully, Allah says. فَاسْتَمِعُوا لَهُ. Those of you who call besides Allah, they were not able to create a fly, a dhubab, even if they gathered together. And if a fly were to snatch something from them, they will not be able to retrieve it. ضَعُفَ الطَّالِبُ وَالْمَطْلُوبُ. How weak and feeble is the one who seeks and one that is sought. And we talked about this at one point, where we said, if a fly were to snatch something from you, can you get it back? You should say, yeah, I'm going to catch the fly and take it away and get the food back. You know what happens? The fly has something called a proboscis. Yeah? Its tongue. What it does, when it takes in something, food or something, it squirts from its tongue enzymes. Goes into the food and partly digests it. And then it sucks it back in. Yeah? So, when it's retrieving, it's already digested partly. Can you retrieve it? Can you unfry an egg? You can't. Allah is using an example, an imagery with a fly. with a real example, as mundane as a fly. And then an imagery is used to understand how weak these people are who call besides Allah, the people who are the mushriks. It's like them. They're weak, how weak they are. Carry on. Another example. Allah uses those who Allah wants to guide someone, He expands their breast, and those who wants He to be left alone astray, He narrows and constricts them as if they were climbing up in the sky. And you know what happens when you go up to the sky in high altitude. This is how you feel. Lack of oxygen and pressure. Real example. But the imagery is there. This kind of imageries the Arabs didn't use. But the Qur'an introduced this new repertoire of images. They're real, they're meaningful, they're correct. They're amazing. Why amazing? Look at this example. The example of is like the darkness in a sea, deep ocean, covered by waves above which are clouds. Darkness one above the other. If a man were to stretch his hand, he won't be able to see it. Yeah? For Allah, if He doesn't give light, there is no light. If you look at the oceans, in deep oceans, there are interoceanic waves. Waves are normally on the surface, right? But there are also waves which are inside the deep ocean. They are interoceanic waves. So the Quran talks about interoceanic waves, surface waves, and clouds, one above the other. An imagery to understand how there are levels of darknesses and how they're covered with darknesses like this, to tell about some people, how they are. But yes, the imagery is real. The imagery is fantastic in what sense? Because this is something that they wouldn't have known. Because you need satellite imagery to find out that the interoceanic waves. You can't just go to a shallow sea and find these deep interoceanic waves. Okay, so the next point was going to be on iltifat, or a sudden transition. We'll leave it there for next time, inshallah. I think we've gone through enough technical material. So what we have covered is basically the construction of the Quranic language. The Quran have linguistic units, surah and ayah. How the surahs are constructed, how unique and how different they are. How ayah, how they end compared to the ordinary speech. How the constructions themselves are not replaceable, irreplaceable. If you were to use a similar word or a verb or a noun here and there with this particular pattern or expression or a construct, it doesn't work. It becomes a laughing, meaningless expression. And we gave some examples in detail for how the Quranic, stylistics and the whole Quran itself brings newness in its beginning of the surah, in its ending of the ayah, how the surah begins with different forms, how even the expression starts totally unlike that we are familiar, they were familiar in the times of the pre-Islamic times. Ala layta sha'ri. Have you heard of this in this Quran ever? But this is famous poems like this. Kifa nabki min dhikra habibin wa manzili. You can make it beautiful like with the naghma, like the tajweed, but still like you will say, it doesn't sound like Quran. It's not Quran. Quran has its own rhymes and meters within its structures, within its construct. And we gave some examples of the particles and the conjunctions, and we gave examples of imagery. So these are technical aspects of the Quranic construction or stylistics, and as we develop more, you will realize why then the Quran cannot be ever imitated. This is the ijaz. This is why you will be the miracle. So, Jazakumullahu khairan. May Allah give us the tawfiq, the ability to understand the Quran, reflect on its messages, and apply its message in our lives, and give us the the inspirations and the encouragement to reflect and study and ponder on its verses and to learn the language of the Qur'an. Learn the language of the Qur'an. Why? You will realize the language of the Qur'an is not like any other language. So there is now such a thing as Quranic Arabic. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.